Another World came out on the Apple II and MS-DOS back in the late 80s, and was one of those games that blew everyone away that played it. But I never had a computer back then, and the only time I was ever able to see it was watching the original PC version played on a pre-recorded video at a local Babbage's. But even then, I was amazed at what I was seeing. That was the first time I ever saw a game telling its story through animated cutscenes. It also looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. But I just accepted that I'd never get to play it, since PCs costed at least $800 billion back then. At least that's what my 8-year-old self figured. So I was pretty shocked years later when I see Another World show up at my local video store for the good old Super NES, now named Out of This World for some reason. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I was going to get, since a Super NES was no match for a PC in terms of power, and Out of This World definitely looked like it needed some power to run it. But I was at least hoping that a little bit of what I saw on that Babbage's video screen would come through on the Super NES, and thankfully, I wasn't too disappointed. Firing up Out of This World brings up the introduction. The opening sorta tells you what's going on, but it all basically boils down to you being a scientist named Lester that was in the middle of doing some super dangerous sciencey type stuff. Of course, things go horribly wrong and Lester finds himself teleported to an alien world where everything wants to kill him the second he gets there. Sorta like the science fiction version of Australia. After a quick introduction to murderous wildlife, Lester's taken captive by a few not-so-friendly aliens. From there, it's all about you working with a fellow prisoner to escape the alien prison camp. It's a cool story, and one that's told with no text at all. Everything's conveyed through the cinematics or by character animation. And while most of it's obscured by design, it always makes you feel like you're really in another world. I've always enjoyed this type of minimalistic approach to storytelling, and Out of This World is a great example of how to do it well, and it's honestly one of my favorite things about the game. But story aside, the first thing you'll really notice about Out of This World is its graphics. It was a really neat game to look at back in the day, and even on the less powerful Super NES, the artwork and animation come through with barely anything lost from the PC release, besides everything being a lower resolution. Even the animated cutscenes made it through, which almost caused me to go into a fit of excitement when that intro first came on the screen. There was really nothing else on the Super NES that looked like it, and it always stood out to anyone that saw it, especially when comparing it to the colorful, cartoony worlds that most games back then were shoving down our throats. Out of This World offered a darker, more violent world to explore. That was probably a bit of a departure from last weekend's rental of something like Mr. Nuts. Honestly, the majority of 16-bit games all kind of run together in my head now, but I really think Out of This World still stands out to this day. Once you've pulled yourself off the floor from all those neato graphics, the game puts you right into its world without any warning. Controlling things may initially look simple thanks to its 2-button layout, but it's actually more complex than first impressions let on. At first, all it seems Lester can do is either run, kick, or jump his way around the levels, but you'll soon find a gun that not only fries enemies to a crisp, but can also put up a laser shield that protects you. This is when things start getting a little more hectic, as you'll be running to get into position, putting up a shield, then ducking to fire off a few shots before you have to put up another shield. And all of this is done with just 2 buttons, which you'd think would make things super simple, but it's really not. There's just too many things going on that you need to do at once, and it feels really cramped to have to rely on 2 buttons to do it all with. Stick with it though, and eventually you'll be fending off multiple alien waves without too much of a problem. And while all of that may make Out of This World sound like an action game, it's not. It's actually more of an adventure game at heart. Sure, you get to shoot and kill aliens throughout the game, but you're going to have to deal with puzzle solving more than balls to the wall action. Some of the puzzles in the game are your standard figure out this obscure thing so you can progress type puzzle, but the majority of the puzzles will probably kill you before you even realize it's a puzzle. Most of the time you'll walk into a new screen and die immediately and have no clue what to do. So it's up to you to find your way through. It's pretty fun to figure these puzzles out, but the side effect is that you'll be dying a lot in Out of This World, and when I say a lot, I mean a lot. Falling onto spikes, getting mauled by alien gorillas, drowning, and even getting killed by lowly worms will come quick and often. It can be discouraging, especially thanks to the cutscenes that show your horrific death in detail. But you have to realize that dying is just part of the game, so get used to it. The biggest problem with the constant dying is that the checkpoint system kinda sucks, sometimes making you redo several steps before you finally get back to what's killing you. It can be frustrating, but at least it's always super satisfying to finally get past a part that's killed you well over a dozen times. But even with tons of puzzles and obstacles in his way, the biggest thing that Lester, and by extension you, will have to overcome are the controls. I already mentioned that the 2-button layout isn't the most elegant, but that's really only the start. The game's smooth animation may look good in motion, but it makes for sluggish controls. And until you can get the hang on how it works, you'll probably be throwing the controller as Lester misses yet another jump, or doesn't do what you tell him to do. The game's by no means unplayable, but it's just something you have to have patience with to learn. And even once you do, you'll still probably find Lester occasionally not responding when you need him to the most. It's by far the game's biggest problem. Another problem with the game is just how poorly it can run. Sure, the graphics and animation made it over mostly unscathed from the PC release, but the performance sure didn't. For the most part, the game runs fine, if a little framey. Other times though, the game comes to a literal crawl as there's just too much going on for the poor Super NES to handle. The worst offender is probably this scene where the cave rocks are falling down on top of you. I mean, seriously, look at this. It's running at like 3 frames per second. And this isn't some scene where you're just running through it. You have to actually use precise timing here to avoid the rocks. It's not easy even when the game's running perfect on the PC, but it's almost impossible to do with a frame rate this low on the Super NES. And while that's probably a worst case scenario, the low frame rate's still noticeable throughout the entire game, and that makes for a really inconsistent experience controlling Lester, as if it wasn't hard enough already. And of course, we can't get through a review of Out of This World without mentioning the game's length. To be blunt, it's way too short. While it may take you a while to figure out the game's puzzles, you probably won't need more than a few hours to do so. And once you figure them out, you can probably play through the entire game in just under half an hour. Yep, you heard that right, just under half an hour. The game's brutal and sometimes cheap difficulty goes a long way in making you replay those scenes over and over in hopes of making the game longer, but it doesn't take much more than a bit of trial and error to get past any scene in the game. And once you figure it out, you'll be running through the game like it's nothing. It's still fun to play through, but a 25-minute long game is still a pretty big downer for anyone that paid full retail price for Out of This World back in the day. But even if it's short, hard to control, and full of cheap deaths, Out of This World is still one of my favorite adventure games. The minimalistic storytelling and visuals go a long way in still making me genuinely excited to play the game. And while it's hard to recommend the Super NES version to someone, the remastered version that's on modern consoles and phones is still worth looking at, as long as you can accept that it was a product of its time. And if you can manage that, along with having a saint's amount of patience, then I think you'll understand why Out of This World really is Out of This World.